Welcome to PhilanthroThink from Carleton University's MP&L program. I'm Megan.
And I'm Emily. And in each episode, you will hear from a rotating team of hosts, including Daniel, Fengwen, and myself.
We'll interview leaders, philanthropists, and innovators to explore the challenges and opportunities shaping philanthropy today.
No matter your role, you'll gain fresh insights and strategies that can inspire your work.
Enjoy the episode, and please subscribe and stay tuned for more.
Before we begin today's episode, we would like to recognize that we are recording and launching this episode during National Indigenous History Month, and we would also like to acknowledge the lands that we're joining from today. So in Ottawa, we are on traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe. In Toronto, we recognize the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and in Halifax, we are on ancestral and unceded Mi'kmaq territory. And we are grateful to live, work, and gather on these lands and recognize the enduring presence and stewardship of Indigenous people, past, present, and future. And we also just want to invite our guest, Wanda, to share her own connections to the land if she wishes to do so.
I love that. Thank you for that, Emily. The connection to the land doesn't really matter where I am. It is a part of our being, our culture, and I'm just grateful to be sitting with you here today in the areas that you are. And sun's out. It's summer's almost here, so let's celebrate that as we move into the summer solstice coming up soon.
Welcome, everyone, to PhilanthroThink. I'm Megan.
And I'm Emily, and we are so honored to have you with us, and we're especially excited about our guests today.
Absolutely. Today, we are joined by Wanda Brascoupe, a true leader in Indigenous philanthropy and a passionate relationship builder for Indigenous-led change.
Wanda's journey has inspired so many, from her work with the Circle on Philanthropy, her role in shaping the Philanthropic Declaration of Action, her creation of the All-Indigenous Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, which applies Indigenous ways of knowing and being on top of the Western philanthropic model, and also her ongoing mentorship and advocacy for Indigenous brilliance in giving.
Wanda, thank you so much for joining us, for spending some time with us and our listeners. Welcome to PhilanthroThink.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Emily. Really happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to dive in, and we'd like to start just by rolling things back a little bit and opening things up to talk a little bit more about your journey into philanthropy. So, Wanda, we're wondering, knowing that you are a force in Indigenous philanthropy, where did that start? So, what was the seed? Was there a particular moment or person, or maybe it's like an entire space that really brought you into this work? But we'd just love to hear more about how this work started for you.
That's a great question, Megan. As we said before, many people fall into the sector by accident. You're not 6 years old sitting in your living room floor playing with whatever you're playing with and say, I really want to be in philanthropy. That isn't how I thought about it at all. How I ended up into this, my reflection on that question was I've always believed in the importance of bringing people together. I fell into it. I was a business owner, and I was actually invited into the space a couple of different ways. Given my natural, aptitude or natural way of gathering people around an idea and taking it forward, whether it be in a club situation or in a girlfriend's organizing birthday parties, just that natural flow of gathering and creating space for people so that they could enjoy whatever it is that we were doing. With that, I got invited for the first thing I ever did was got invited to my children were little, and our community needed a playground. They needed an apparatus for small children. And I was asked to do this by a group of women. Like, you'd be really good at doing this fundraising. Never thought I would ever do anything like that, but I have a bit of competitiveness in me. And they had been trying to fundraise for 2 years. And I thought, well, if I'm really going to do this, I want to do it and be built next year. So gathered great people around me and were able to facilitate it and get it built. That was one way. And then move forward, been asked by community members, Indigenous community members that were working in this sector, even though I wasn't in it, say, would you come and sit on the board? You bring a different perspective. You bring one of positivity and abundance. And that's basically stemming from the belief and the knowledge of living in community, understanding community. But I've been lucky enough to spend some time on reservations and reserves all through Turtle Island, going into Hawaii, little bit of the Earth Summit when it began, understanding global Indigenous peoples and how our communities actually work is really kind of what brought me into the space, invited me into the space that I am now.
Okay, so Wanda, we spend a lot of time having conversations in the sector around philanthropy, specifically around decolonization. And so I'm
Mhm.
curious if there are examples that you want to share or ways that you want to speak to what practically a decolonization of philanthropy could look like or what that means to you.
Thanks, Emily. This is a question that comes up a lot, and I did have to think about it significantly because the terminology of decolonizing is not necessarily a term that I use, but I understand the principle of it. And the principle of it, if we go to the root of that word, because sometimes language in philanthropy, particularly as it relates to Indigenous people, sometimes it can end a conversation rather than expand a conversation. So it's not a hesitancy around it. It's just placing it in a way that can be a dialogue can be continued. So if I'm thinking about the term decolonizing, what it means to me is the rethinking of who holds power and who decides what's valuable, and then from a philanthropic standpoint, how resources flow. So having that as a placemaking approach ahead of how do I decolonize this program I'm creating, or how do I decolonize my board? What does it mean? It is a word and it has multiple different layers to it, but what does it mean to that organization? So for this conversation, that's where I'd like to place spaces. So just rethinking who holds the power and who decides what's valuable.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I think as an extension of that, because I feel like we're just going to start to dig further in as we unpack both language. And I think what you've opened the door to is a discussion around power, which is so much of, again, what this exploration is, both today and within the sector, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, just to again pull the thread on that, how do you see Indigenous-led initiatives changing the game on the ground when it comes to actually changing that engagement with power, changing that engagement with, like, it's so many things. It's knowledge sharing, it's really redefining what generosity can look like. I'm just wondering if there's some examples you could share with us, or again, what are you seeing that works that again we could maybe dive into?
Thank you, Megan. This is a great question. So I'm just going to use there are many examples out there. And really in the last 15 years, there's been in the Canadian context, there has been a really catapult of Indigenous ways of knowing and being within the philanthropic model. Some a bit more Western, definitely some that are really following the root of whatever that community's teaching or that region's teachings are. But for this conversation, I will use my experience in the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. So back in 2019, there were a couple of conversations happening. I was a part of one, and there was another conversation around disbursement quota. And in that disbursement quota, we looked at it from an Indigenous perspective, from an Indigenous-led specific. There were more charities that were coming out there. There are definitely many nonprofits. And if this disbursement quota was going to be increased within the Canadian context, how could that look for Indigenous-led nonprofits and charities? So at that moment, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we just said, let's just take 5% of the population, something really easy. What would that look like? And in December of 2019, it ended up being about $1 billion. So what if we created a $1 billion fund and applied Indigenous ways of knowing being on top of philanthropic model? Well, February, March 2020 comes along. And at that moment in our sector, we all know that things shifted. They had to shift. And I'm really proud of that in terms of the sector-wide, global sector-wide, of how we came to that moment. So it was absolutely a time for research and discovery, right? It really was development. It was how do we support our communities, whatever that community was working with. And at that moment, three foundations came to a small group of us and said, we have like 1.2 million. We know that the approaches that traditional philanthropy applications and foundations definitely don't know how to get to the communities who probably are in need of it most and doing some incredible work. What if we gave it to you? What would you do with it? At that moment, we had to respond and be accountable to a group of people that we brought together that were about 30 Indigenous people working in the sector who understood the language, who understood, and we posed a question to them. And in that question moment, there was definitely conversation. It wasn't, yes, let's do it. There was some hesitancy, and rightly so. There were some concerns, but at the end of the day, we were really grateful to have the mentorship of Mary Simon, who then got another job after, during that pandemic. And she reminded us of her traditional ways, but apply to all really Indigenous people globally, which is when the whale comes in, you don't figure out how you're going to cut it up in 2 weeks. You're going to cut it up and you're going to get it to the community who needs it most. So it's with that type of inspiration, we said we are going to apply how we know our communities work on top of the philanthropic model. We know how to reach people. We know how to converse with people. And so that's all we're going to do. We're not making up anything new. We are meeting the community where they're at. And then coupled with that, there's innovation that happened with that approach, but there was also innovation that happened with the potential partners. And in telling the story of the brilliance and ingenuity that exists in our communities every single day, that the philanthropic model, if we go back to this quote unquote decolonizing terminology, it is what is valuable and who is evaluating that valuableness or success. In doing so, we were able to cause less harm in this application process, speak to people the way that you would speak to people in your communities. You all have your own communities. You all know different nuances and language and approaches. And we did it from coast to coast to coast. And then again, the innovation with how we brought along what ended up being our 30 plus partners and raising, we never led with money. Philanthropy, we always lead with money, and money means success. In this case, if we go back to the root of what philanthropy is, it's love of mankind and applying Indigenous ways of knowing, there is that definite alignment of serving your community in a good way. Doesn't matter what community you're from globally, but serving your community in a good way. And that is where we found that sweet spot of intersection that led to the success of IPRF.
Thank you for sharing that. It's such a big example because, again, there's so many learnings that can be unpacked from that. And before we sort of go in another direction, I just want to point out to just a reflection. I really appreciate what you said about the not leading with money. And I think, again, if we're to go into the weeds a little bit and again use some vernacular that the industry is used to, it's that difference between designating and undesignating funds, and undesignating funds meaning having things be as open as possible, leads to really aligning with, again, a trust-based system and a system that makes sense for the folks that you're trying to serve, right? And so I think that I feel like I've used, this as an example when I'm trying to make the point that we need to actually open up funding. We need to be less restrictive. And again, we come back to power of who makes the decision around where funding flows, right?
I really like that question and that thoughtfulness. You are a professional, and I love the fact that you have that experience. And then Emily, you have the community. You're a really great combination of how things work on both, I don't want to say sides, but within the system of what we find ourselves in. And the success of the, we all talk about the power over, right? Is the power over actually getting us to where we want to go? Is this approach getting us where we want to go? I think we can probably say no. Doesn't matter if you're working in unhoused people, it doesn't matter if you're working in mental health, are we actually getting where we want to go? So how do we get out of the way of ourselves? So thinking about what you said, Megan, I often describe it as a ball in the box. So the charitable tax laws that we all abide by, we have to abide by, are the box. But in service of the community, in terms of philanthropy and the origins of philanthropy and the love of mankind and the applying that on top of the box, trying to get to work in a good way, but yet being compliant, how do you become that ball within that box and push up against where you can better serve, and therefore resources, we could talk about money now, resources will go further, farther, faster when community has the ability to say, this is how I need to stretch, and that flexibility to allow them to stretch. So we have to do the heavy lifting. I mean, Megan, you probably know that well. Emily, you know that well from a different perspective. And I definitely have experience at that. How do we be flexible? How do we do that heavy lift rather than the applicant coming to the conversation saying, I'll just use this as an example. We want you to apply to X, Y, and Z, but only on Tuesdays and Thursdays can you use your left hand. We don't know the sector well. They need their left hand all the days of the week. So how do we get out of our own way? And how do we push the sector to adjust policies and approaches?
Here in Nova Scotia, we have conversations a lot around two-eyed seeing, which to my understanding is a Mi'kmaq kind of way of understanding what you're talking about the box and the ball and the pushing back and forth. So I'm curious if that's a concept that you use or are familiar with, or what other kind of language you use around that, this idea of really kind of what you're talking about of taking the model of philanthropy that exists and laying Indigenous ways of being and knowing on top of that, and kind of how that comes together for you.
I love this question. Two-eyed seeing is sometimes exhausting. It can be exhausting. And so the term two-eyed seeing isn't just Mi'kmaq. It actually is a term that many, many people that are working within a Western, you could be working in a bank, you could be working in insurance, you could be working in construction. It really ends up, the two-eyed seeing means learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing being so you don't lose yourself, and then the other eye with the strengths of the Western mainstream knowledge. And if you're able to do that, your outcomes have a potential to be as inclusive as possible so that each community can understand in a different way. Translation, sometimes people call it code switching. It really ends up being if you spoke two languages, if you speak in French and you speak in English, and the translation, sometimes you can say things better in French, and sometimes you can say things better in English. And that's the beauty, I believe, of two-eyed seeing. It actually strengthens the work. Sometimes you need to lean more over into your teachings, and then sometimes you can lean over into the English language or the Western way to get to where you need to go.
And now, a word from IG Private Wealth Management. Hi, we are back with PhilanthroThink's special mini episode with IG Private Wealth Management. And today joining us again is Christine Van Kallenberg. So Christine, we know that IG Private Wealth Management offers personalized charitable giving strategies to help clients make a meaningful impact while also being mindful of tax efficiency. But it's clear that giving back isn't just something that you advise your clients on. It's something that your team lives out as well. Can you share a bit about how IG gives back to the community and how this reflects your company's culture and values?
Well, at IG Private Wealth Management, we actually walk the talk. And that's because one of our primary community initiatives spanning coast to coast is the IG Wealth Management Walk for Alzheimer's, which is their largest fundraising event. We're very proud to support that initiative. And over the last 10 years, we've helped them raise over $50 million. And all of our employees are very driven by our mission to inspire financial confidence. And that's why we want to make sure that we're also helping our communities. We also are able to help Alzheimer's because we participate in a number of financial literacy webinars, particularly directed towards vulnerable persons. And we want to make sure that these families feel supported and they know how to work through a period of cognitive decline and also prevent bad experiences, perhaps with predators and online scams. And we want to make sure that we're there for our community and we're helping them and all work together.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This is a general source of information only. It is not intended to provide personalized tax, legal, or investment advice, and is not intended as a solicitation to purchase securities. For more information on this topic or any other financial matter, please contact an IG Wealth Management consultant.
Now, back to the show. Thinking about, again, that approach, which would totally follow you through, I'm sure, all of the work that you're doing, probably like, again, anyone engaging in this this work in a good way. Like I'm curious if there are any examples of when, again, that almost shared space or shared way of seeing in terms of like the trust-based philanthropy that we've been talking about and Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, were there any moments where you saw that sort of shared way of seeing and thinking surprise you, or, end in a way or lead to an outcome that was not what you expected, but maybe was very positive, or again, led to learning? I'm just curious, like, is there any moment that you could share with us or a story you could tell about that?
Yes, this is probably my most emotional, but yet haha moment, if you want to use that terminology. When we started this, and it was pandemic, and we were speaking to community the way they needed to be speaking, on the phone, we were taking faxes, we were, getting on Zooms, we were talking at all times of the day, we were meeting the community where they were at the time. And we knew that language was going to matter. Again, that translation of this is what philanthropy does, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do, this is where, but yet centering the answers that community has. And that was where the focus was. We had to say no. We had to say no to some incredible applications. So there were two things off of that. In that saying no, and I remember writing those first emails to people that I had built a COVID phone conversation with. And we all remember what those were like, right? We were all in the same boat. It didn't matter where we were. All the fears, all the things that were going on, remote communities. It was a moment in time. And we did have to say no to applications, gorgeous applications. Periodically, if we knew another funder that was doing it, we would bring them together. So again, we did the heavy lifting. But we got a very first email back after we said no. And it said, "Thank you for this application process. I have never been seen like this in anything else. You need to share this." And wherever the resources went to, we knew they needed it more than us. We knew we were sort of on, when we got one, we thought, oh, isn't that great? And then we got another, and then we got another, and then we got another. And the anecdotal way of the response to the community, it wasn't all kumbaya, don't get me wrong, but you spoke of one moment. That's when I knew the approach and the trust and the cultural nuance in the language mattered in this space.
I appreciate that because, again, not every story is going to end quite the same way. But absolutely what I feel like this reinforces, and I think about this a lot in my own work too, is that, yeah, it was the heavy lifting was on you to build the scaffolding properly, or to build it in a mindful way, so that, again, those people you were engaging with came away from it, even if they didn't come away with funding, at least they didn't come away, feeling, hurt by it, right? I'm just wondering if you can, if you could elaborate on that, of this phenomenal approach. It was a phenomenal endeavor, a very big endeavor. But when we think about the day-to-day, I wonder how you could provide some guidance for our listeners who might be professionals across the sector. How can they bring like an ounce of what you described to the day-to-day? Because I always think it's not always in the big projects that we see the real impact. It is in those little micro steps that build to something more. So I'm wondering if you could, just share some reflections on that.
Thank you, Megan. I really appreciate that, because you are a CFR, and I considered it. Like, I thought, is this something I should be doing? Is this something? And I realized it isn't. But I respect that path, that whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that's a path that you take, because it does obviously have value whether you're an AFB member, however it is that you wish to engage in the sector. But many of us are working at home, or we're hybrid, or we're focused on, the day-to-day outcomes. So how do you not lose yourself in that siloed, and while it's important, how do you keep your 2 feet on the ground? And so I do have an answer. My answer is, this is just my example. Talk to your family. Talk to your family about what does philanthropy mean to them, or your community that you're serving. Emily, you're in the Mi'kmaq land and you're working with these youth. What is philanthropy to them? So the place setting can happen locally, it can happen in an urban setting. It'd be really interesting. Why I say your family, Megan, because you are in an institution that understands development, right? And there's a certain part of it. So go to your family and say, what is philanthropy? And I'll tell you the reason why. In Indigenous languages, philanthropy doesn't exist. The term doesn't exist. However, there are values that many languages have about you being a helper, a translation to a helper. You're there to help, whether it be an elder, whether it be, and it's a very honorable job to be asked to be a helper. So I have my mother, the oldest woman in our community. Her language was Tuskar as her first language, and speaks English, reads, writes, all of that. And she asked me, what are you doing today? And I said, I have meetings in philanthropy. And she said, she doesn't get it. And she says to me, are you working for the people today? It grounds me holistically, wholeheartedly. So when the tip is, for lack of a better word, when you center those individuals and those faces, or that community that you're serving, it will always make you make a better decision. And you don't stay in those silos, and you are willing to push, because we know the system. We know the ecosystem. Some of it's good and some of it's harder, right? Some of it's harder. So where is it that you are going to try to do better every day for those that you serve? In your case, right, students, I'm assuming,
yeah.
like the students who are definitely probably needed and necessary. And Emily, the youth that you work with, if you keep that focused. I would love to hear, Megan, what do you think your family would say?
Well, what's coming to mind actually is I think I do this a little bit every day. I have a young son at home, and he's 10. And something we've done with him every night at bedtime since he was old enough to talk and engage with us in a little conversation before he goes to bed, as we do. And I think different families have a version of this, but it's your peach, pit, and fuzzy. So you do a little recap of the day. Your peach is something good that happened. Your pit, something not so good that happened. But your fuzzy is actually the most important. It's who did you help today? And actually, over the years, what he needs from us when we put him to bed is we equally need to engage and tell him our 3 things. And something that I have reflected on over the years is, my work makes it very easy to have a fuzzy. Even when I've had the harder days, I can at least say, well, I did help people today. And again, I've been very fortunate to work in healthcare. I've worked in different environments. And I think that's why I stay in this work, because there is always a fuzzy. There's always something you can engage with that allows that. It's like a little daily accountability that I get to sprinkle in. But I think I'm going to be a little more intentional about it now, because it's turned into a nice little habit. But yeah, it's like if you, again, just do that little reflection, like, what have you done? Or if you know that you have that little accountability piece at the end of the day, what would you report back on? And how does that influence your decision making during the day? So
that's really interesting, because putting a mirror up to yourself, philanthropy as a sector, it does seem like it's about money and only money, and people get money or they don't get money.
Yeah.
The reality is that when you are willing to have humility in your work and put a mirror up to yourself, we're choosing to do this program. And the reflection is, well, who asked me to do this program? Did my community ask me to do this program? Or was this just a really great strategy session at a table? And I sit on boards. So, I mean, I understand it from A to B, or A to Z really, or A to Z, however you want to say it, that where are the goals being set? Who is setting them? And how do I ensure I don't stay in that silo? And how do I ensure other voices come into the daily work that I do?
Yeah, I love
Yeah, I
that.
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious, pulling back to the conversation that we were having about your experience and having to deliver some of those hard conversations and being able to tell or needing to tell groups that they didn't receive funding. And I was just reflecting on how beautiful it is to be able to create a space where people have so much trust in the process and feel safe to share and to know that even if they're not the group that's receiving the funding, to know that the funding went to someone who is so deserving and to be able to share in that joy with other groups as well. And so for folks who are joining into this conversation, we have people who listen from all across the sector, from many different contexts. And so coming from a non-Indigenous context and non-Indigenous organizations, I'm curious if you have thoughts on how these non-Indigenous organizations can work to be better partners for Indigenous-led groups and to foster some of those feelings of safety as well in the process.
That's a great question. When Nicole McDonald and I started the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund together, we didn't really realize that this was going to happen. And my co-lead was Victoria Grant. We didn't, and a great board that we had. We didn't know this was going to be an outcome. It was applying how we know communities work. So, let's just be clear. This wasn't, we had this great idea and it's going to work. All we did was we knew who we were talking to fully, coast to coast to coast. And in that, we knew that language was going to matter. We knew that outreach was going to matter. We knew that meeting organizations, some people have development people, some people are doing it off the side of their desk, and many, many more are doing it off the side of their desk. So the value of the application wasn't that beautifully written, and we understood it. We actually tried to understand the organization. These are right, and maybe the executive director is writing it, or maybe they have a grant writer that they bring in. So we tried not to let that cloud our humanness in reading an application. That was number one. Number two, knowing that language mattered, we did that cultural shift in nuance. So if we think about the two-eyed seeing, we leaned more into Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but yet still working within the philanthropic model. Now, this was easy because, I grew up in the community. It's easy. So your question is really, you have different types of people working from coast to coast to coast in the philanthropic sector who have a desire to engage with, but don't want to make a mistake. So I'm just going to step back for that one moment and how to get through that, because I did this LinkedIn post in 2023, I think it was, and it snuck up to 100,000 views. And it basically said, or whatever the analytics are on LinkedIn, are you a beginner in reconciliation? And 70% of the people are like, yes, even though they had been working and I have experience. The beginnerness was what keeps you from not moving ahead because you don't want to make a mistake. Why we started Indigenous Philanthropy Advisors was that we knew those barriers were actually imposed or perceived barriers. So my speaking to an individual working in an organization, be it a large one or a small one, and wanting to engage with Indigenous peoples in a good way, and it's timely. We're 10 years off the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're 10 years off the Declaration of Action for the philanthropic sector. How far have we come and where can we go? My thoughts and recommendation are around it is basically to lead with the people first. Do the heavy lifting. If there is an application, if possible, give them a call. If that works, or if it doesn't work, adjust the way that you're working so that you can create relationships, you can start. And then second off is Google is our best friend. How do we reach these people? There are different ways of knowing. And being Emily, you work within the Halifax. How do you reach your community that you wish to work with? You know, you have street credibility. You ask people. My thought would be around you. And then for you, Megan, how would you work as an example? Does anything what I'm saying resonating with you and actionable tomorrow? Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned before humility, like that word has come up a couple of times. And I feel like that is a big part of, again, the way forward is this
Mm-hmm.
approach to work and your participation in the systems that already exist with a renewed sense of humility. I do see the self-imposed barriers from folks who are trying to engage or thinking they'd like to engage because they're scared. And then I also see a real adherence to the systems that are already in place.
Mm-hmm.
And I come back to I love again your example of like the ball in the box. There's a lot of comfort being right against that wall and really
Mm-hmm.
understanding the parameters of the box.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of what you're talking about is understanding that the box is both perceived and also, you know, something that we need to work around, as you talked
Mm-hmm.
about before. If I could just add, again, a follow-up question to that is, knowing that you had that really successful post on LinkedIn and a lot of people engaged with it, and a lot of people do feel like they're beginners. I'm curious though about, what you've seen in your work and in working with, folks across this sector. What gives you hope when you think about the future of the Canadian philanthropic system?
What gives me hope? I have three daughters that are incredible, and hopefully that's my gift to the world. Their brilliance and ingenuity is what gives me hope. In my work, taking that and in my work, applying it to the work in the philanthropic sector, there is so much opportunity. That is gives me hope. There is where we've come in the last 10 years. Let's just go from, it's a decade already. And the trajectory, it's a pretty good trajectory, but we could really be going further, farther, faster together. A trust-based philanthropy gives me hope. But applying it gives me even more hope. The concept is great, but the applicability of it gives me far, far greater hope. The increase of Indigenous people on boards gives me hope, be it corporate, be it foundation boards, that gives me hope. Even though we've come a significant way, there are more people that are, from even an Indigenous standpoint, there are more people working in the sector. There weren't necessarily, because it was a sector that we didn't necessarily engage with. We were placed in the third sector. We didn't even know we were placed in the third sector. We really, from a nonprofit, we understood the nonprofit world. We got that down packed, but we don't even know that there's another part of the forest called philanthropy and what that landscape is. So that gives me hope. It's a multitude. Social impact gives me hope. Impact investing gives me hope. We think about Rave Indigenous outcomes, these types of models, utilizing not just a granting tool, or let's even go to not just a golf tournament, right? Let's go to all of the tools that exist out there that you're sitting in how are your resources invested? That is something that whether you have Indigenous or not, it can be talked about at the board table. It can be talked about at the executive level. So that's what gives me hope.
I'm glad to hear that there is that could be a whole, holistic
Mm-hmm.
answer for you because yeah, again, there is a lot of work. And I do think that that's why folks get a little bit afraid when they want to engage because there's so much to be done. But like you say, like there's a lot of good work going on. So thank you for sharing. So Wanda, thinking about again the breadth of experience that we've talked about today, thinking about your research, and then thinking about the way forward, knowing that we've talked about hope in the future as well. I'm just curious, what encouragement would you give, or how would you frame trust-based philanthropy for those philanthropists, those funders that maybe have started to engage but are sitting on the sidelines but want to engage? What would that framing be that you offer them um, to engage with trust based philanthropy, to engage with Indigenous led organizations, so that we really encourage them to move the dial from that 1% of funding that we know, is where things are right now, so that again we can encourage change and increase that funding over time?
I appreciate that question. So I'm going to take it from three different. One's the storytelling. One's a place. I like this place setting. As you can tell, we've all have experience in being uncomfortable, all of us. So I'm going to take a general approach that we've probably everyone has been at. So we're back in 7th and 8th grade. Okay. Remember that feeling? We're all in 7th and 8th grade. And in many cases, you go to the dance, right? You're excited, you want to go, but you've never done this before. But it's intriguing, but you don't want to make a mistake. So you have 7th and 8th grade people, you have people on one side, other people on another side, and you have the early adopters in the corner. You're like, I don't know what's going on. I want to be comfortable in this, but I don't want to make a mistake. So if you just think about that from your own perspective of how you move through it, we've all been beginners our entire lives at something. And I hope as I get older, I'm still a beginner because I'm going to keep learning. So there's a great quote that learning happens at the edge of understanding, and it isn't going over, it's going through. I just utilize as a simple placemaker. We've all that angst, good angst, bad angst, in one point. I'm going to couple with that in terms of the research. Back when I was at the executive director of the Circle on Philanthropy, we did a study. And one of the questions was, do you feel as though non-Indigenous people, do you feel as though you have a role to play in reconciliation? So that was 10 years ago. And the initial responses that came back were 86 and then sometimes 92, depending, felt as individuals, Canadians, felt as though they personally had a responsibility or could play a role in reconciliation. All right. Now let's couple with that with the research that myself, Mark Bloomberg, Sharon Redsky, and Jessie Lang have done. And in that, it backs the lowly number of 0.2% of funds go to Indigenous-led charities. There's more research coming out, and that aligns with globally. So that's just in Canada. In the US, it's a little bit less than 1%. And globally, the International Funders for Indigenous People, it's at 0.02 of all resource to go to Indigenous-led. Okay, so we have this. That's where I'm thinking about 7th and 8th grade dance. We have 80, anywhere from 86 to 92% of individuals feel as though they have a role to play in reconciliation. I'm not saying philanthropy is the only way, but this is a way to engage. And then on the flip side, you have the lowly number of 1.2%. So what is that tension or the perceived barriers or let's just take it from a foundation standpoint or a high net worth individual or those that are making decisions? What is stopping them? So we use some examples throughout this is humility. It is language. It is a learning. It is a learning and an unlearning. And in the Canadian context, it has occurred. It's been in the newspapers. It is front and center. But there is an opportunity, if we talk about hope, there is an opportunity to move beyond that uncomfortableness, not worrying about getting it right. I would worry about not taking that first step because we don't want in 10 years to be having the same conversation on the same numbers because the other small bit of research is, and it needs to be expanded, so I'm just going to mention it ever so lightly, put a pin in it, is the approach that the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, the anecdotal examples that came back was 30 with a more trust-based philanthropy approach, with more understanding who you're reaching and shifting language so that it reaches that community in a way that they can understand it. $30,000 went further and seeded more black soil, for lack of a better word, we're farmers, than $100,000 of a grant that had, X, Y, and Z, dot the I on a Monday, add the T on the Tuesday. Approach. So isn't that we all hope would happen with the resources in furthering the great vision and missions that many foundations have and many organizations that are wanting to give to and be a part of or stand with and stand behind people that are doing work on the ground. It doesn't have to be Indigenous. It just, in this case, that's what I know.
Wanda, thank you so much. As we kind of wrap up the time that we have together today, I just want to say thank you for being here, for sharing with us, for leading us through this conversation in such a way that felt really genuine and open, that I'm taking so much away from. And so part of what we do here on the show is at the end of every episode, we ask our guest to come up with a question for the person who is going to be on the next episode. And so in our last episode, our guest, Manjeet Bazi, she asked us, if you think about your great, 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 great grandchildren and also the great, 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 great grandchildren of everybody that you work with or who is kind of supported by the work that you do, what do you imagine that they might ask you to do today with your giving, with your community work, or kind of in your own space, so that it truly makes a lasting and generous impact in the future?
I love that question, and it fits really well. From the Haudenosaunee ways of thinking through the Great Law, we are supposed to center ourselves with 7 generations, and we sit in the middle. So it works perfectly, Manjeet. Thank you for that question. My answer is, what can we do today with your giving or community work so that it truly makes a lasting and generous impact? I would like to take it to learning. And the learning component, so just because I mean, I have experience and I've shared that experience, we've shared some bits of research. Thinking about the MPNL and thinking about the program, education of self within this sector is important. There exists, don't do it because I said so. Do it because there's great work with Edgar Villanueva, Decolonizing Wealth. There's great work with the IFIP. There's great work with the Circle. There's great work with the Native Americans in Philanthropy, who've done some great documentation of how to engage with community. So it isn't just me saying it. It's multiple people who have done multiple bits of research, and find that research or that tone that works with your knowledge base, but also works within your organization. Utilize it. Be that person that does that work and then shares it out. That would be my what you could do today to influence future generations.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's something that we can all take away from our conversation.
And you can do.
And then as a follow-up, so Wanda, we now put it to you. We have obviously our next guest. We don't know who they are yet, but we will pass along a question from you to them. So I'm curious, what would that question be that you'd like to pose to our next guest?
All right. As we look to the future of philanthropy, what's one shift funders can make tomorrow, personally or institutionally, that would move us closer to a sector that truly centers people, relationships, and community wisdom first?
Love that. Thank you.
Thank you both, Megan and Emily. It's really been wonderful, and I'm such a proponent of the program and so grateful that it's there. But before we end, I have one last question. Of what I've shared with you today, I believe that there has been an emotional connection and an intellectual connection of the approaches that we've talked about. But is there something that you could take away and apply to your work tomorrow or next week? I'll even give you a week.
I think that what has, of all of the incredible pieces that I could pull from this conversation and all of the action steps that can come from that, I think what's standing out to me the most right now, which might change as I continue to kind of reflect on this and listen back to the episode, is this idea of being in 7th or 8th grade and being at the dance. And I think that that is something that, I feel that is something that would encourage me in my work to take this step. And so as much as there are action steps that I'm seeing from this, doing the learning, having more conversations, really, really rooting into community and continuing to kind of lean into the wisdom of those around me, I think that the step that is going to be the most crucial is when I have those moments of feeling uncomfortable or not being quite sure what to do next. We all made it through 7th and 8th grade. We all kind of grew up, and we did that because we had those experiences. We pushed ourselves out of our comfort zones in all of the ways that we did in all of our lives, and we can take that example in so many different ways. But I think for me, it's remembering that. And so knowing that to get to the place where there's growth, there has to be that step. And really just reminding myself, putting myself back in this conversation, in that example of being uncomfortable, being a teenager, kind of navigating all of those things, I think will be the catalyst for reminding myself to open up dialogue with people around me in the work that I do, in the spaces that I'm in, and to open the computer, find a book, open another resource. I have so many things to continue to learn. And so I think for me, that's the next step, the next day, the next week, the next year of my kind of career and of my learning journey in the sector.
Great, Emily. Just stretch a little bit.
So I think what I keep coming back to, maybe because I'm a very visual person, Wanda, I keep coming back to the ball in the box and that image. And I think because my professional journey is one that continues to move through fairly big structured systems, what I've often thought about is, the way that I can make change or influence or stay very aware of how I can participate in this type of work is, again, that day to day. But what I like about the ball in the box is remembering, okay, there is those walls, but we do have flexibility. We have influence and we have power, even if it's on a micro level, and it makes a difference. And so, what I take away from, again, this incredible conversation is, the humility that's necessary to show up every day and to say, okay, what's my role in this exchange? What can I do for the good that I'm working towards? And what I also loved that, you point out that's a part of my reflection too is, who are the people I'm working for to do this good? Because although I work in systems that are very complex, although I work for bigger organizations, I'm in this business because I really do love people and I want to help. And so I think coming back to that continues to progress this work for me and keeps me humble. And I hope it keeps me humble. So that's what I will make sure that I take away from this and continue to revisit in that day-to-day way that makes it very real. So thank you so much for, again, giving Emily and I so much to think about, and our listeners as well. This has been truly a pleasure to spend some time with you. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you. Now I go. It feels the same over here.